Hello everybody, I am Jarrett Ross, the Genie Vlogger, and welcome back to another Professional Genealogist Reacts. On today's video, I will be reacting to Please Stop Buying Home Genetic Tests, 23andMe Controversy by Dr. Mike. Now this is a video that I've had a lot of people suggesting that I react to. I'm not surprised. I saw it pretty much within the first few hours of it coming out, and I was like instantly ready to have it on the reaction list. For those who are unfamiliar with me, I am a professional genetic genealogist. I've worked in genetic genealogy for many years, and for about 5 years I was also working as an investigative genetic genealogist with the company DNA Labs International, where I was using genetic genealogy to help solve cold case crimes and identify unknown human remains. Now I usually do my reactions as cold reactions. Basically, I don't watch the video beforehand, but in this case I did watch the video, especially because I do watch a lot of Dr. Mike videos, and so I was really hopeful that this was going to be a good video. In some places it's a great video, in other places I am somewhat disappointed, but let's just jump into it.
Genetic testing kits promised us a futuristic look into our DNA, all with the simplicity and convenience of a box delivered right to our front doors. But what happens when the companies behind the promises start to implode? From misleading health guidance to shocking privacy breaches, consumer genetic testing failures are starting to pile up. In this video, we'll dive deep into the dark side of consumer DNA testing, expose the cracks in the science, including my own personal experience, and unpack the fallout from the recent 23andMe debacle.
He makes it sound so scary with the music in the background, but then again, that is kind of part of the video. Unfortunately, one of the things I am disappointed about with the video is in some places it does lean a bit more towards fear-mongering than giving the whole nuance of everything, but we'll continue.
These home testing kits initially gained popularity by promising to give you some information about where your ancestry stemmed from. You probably know how it works, at least at the basic level. You spit into a plastic tube, mail it off, and then a few weeks later you get a DNA report with information about your background, inherited traits, etc.
Now for a lot of people who've done these tests, you may be like, I didn't do a spit tube, and that's because not all the tests do a spit tube. Some of them do the buccal swabs, where they're swabbing the side of your mouth. You do it on each side for 30 seconds and you send it in.
Early on, like many others, I was curious about my own origins and actually reached out to one of the big companies to partner up and help me investigate.
Now, if I remember correctly, his ancestry is Eastern European Jewish, and even more, his family came over fairly recently. I don't remember exactly from where, but with that being the case, his best bet to test for ancestry would be to get into the MyHeritage database, because MyHeritage has the largest database of people within Eastern European countries. So for someone like him who has very recent Eastern European ancestry, probably doesn't have a lot of relatives that are in the Americas or the UK or Australia or New Zealand, which is where most of these testers in the main companies are testing. But with MyHeritage, they've had a lot of distribution centers throughout the years to purposely have it where they have a wider range of people within their database, even though they aren't the largest database. So if he were to truly want to utilize DNA testing for finding out his family ancestry, most especially beyond just the really generic percentage breakdowns, which he kind of showed a little bit earlier, if he wants to learn the family stuff and get the true power out of these DNA tests, which fortunately he doesn't really talk about much in this video, that would probably be one of the best places for him. But based on this video, I'm guessing he's probably not very interested in it because he seems very anti-DNA test.
But in the middle of the project, they abruptly shifted their focus from my family tree to the bigger financial pie in the game, health insights. They wanted me as a doctor to promote at-home genetic health testing. This was new to me, so I needed to look more deeply into what was being offered. When I dove in and actually looked at their data, I found that the health insights they were giving were usually incomplete or completely inactionable.
He doesn't mention which company was doing this. You basically have Ancestry, which I don't know if they stopped doing the health stuff quite as much, but I know that they're kind of not focusing on that really as much. They've always been much more focused on the ancestry aspect. But the other company is 23andMe, and in all honesty, that's who I'm guessing he's talking about, and that's what the main whole subject of this video is about. But, you know, the way that a lot of these things work in terms of being a content creator and having sponsorships is you don't really talk about the things that haven't been done or confirmed, or what, you know, privacy matters. But I'm guessing that it was 23andMe that was reaching out to him, because the other big company that does a lot of promotion on YouTube is MyHeritage. Now, that's not to say MyHeritage doesn't have a health aspect to it. They do, but it's very minimal, and I honestly see them really not talking about it in their advertisements. They're always focused more on their DNA database and especially their billions of records that they have.
For example, how valuable would it be to know that I'm at low risk for developing type 2 diabetes? Should I be eating more unhealthy now? Or another one, how useful is it to know that I'm at high risk for developing Alzheimer's disease? There's really no action I can take given that result, and now I'm forever scarred with that anxiety-provoking news.
For those who have seen a bunch of my videos, and pretty much any time I've ever seen big genetic genealogists discussing the health aspects of these DNA tests, the main thing we always discuss is never take these results as the truth and always consult a geneticist if you do have worries. The health aspect of these DNA tests really is just a fun sort of part to it, and it really isn't something to ever be taken seriously. But as Dr. Mike explains in the video, and this is one of the parts where I really highly agree exactly with what he's saying, is that people don't take it the way that it's supposed to be taken, and more than anything, it causes confusion than actual help. So he used the word actionable, basically meaning if I have a low risk, what action do I take? If I have a high risk, what action do I take? And really the only action that you can take from these DNA tests is, if it worries you, go to a geneticist and get true testing done, have actual consultations with a geneticist. And this is something that I have said in many, many videos of mine. For those who have watched me for a long time, anytime the health aspect of these come up, I always say that if you get something saying that you have a low risk, don't take that as that you have no risk. It's just saying that based on the information they have, which is very minimal, and he's going to get into that in a bit, they think that it's low risk. High risk, then they think, okay, maybe it's high risk, but they're still working with a minimal amount of information.
Then came all the issues for cancer testing. It seemed like that home testing kit was a legit test to rule out genetic cancers. But in reality, they were giving me results without testing all the potential mutations and sequences to make it a truly valuable test to use in lieu of proper genetic counseling.
So here we're seeing on screen that it's using the word variance. And what they mean by variance is that when they're looking at your genome, they're looking at billions of base pairs. So that's the ACTGs we're talking about. And at specific spots, what they call single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, SNPs, they're a spot within the genome where if there's a letter they're expecting and you have the variation, that variation has been tied to certain genes or diseases or things like that. So as we can see here on screen, we see more than 1,000 variants in these genes are known to increase cancer risk. Only 3 of those variants are included in this test. So basically, they're just looking at 3 specific spots on your genome to see, is it have the A or does it have the T? And even more, remember that this is a base pair. So the variability will also depend on, do you have it in both of the pairs or just one of them? So at one spot, is it AA, AT, or TT? Because if the variant we're expecting is TT and they have an AT, that's going to be a lower risk than if you have TT. But this is also getting to the heart of the issue with the health aspect of these DNA tests, in that they're only testing a very minimal amount of these. And there are some more advanced home genetic tests, such as whole genome sequencing tests, but even then, you still need to be working with an actual geneticist to understand the results, because it gets really nitty-gritty and it's a lot that goes into this.
To me, this form of middle ground, entertainment-esque testing only created more confusion and certainly didn't replace a true meeting with a genetic specialist, so I killed the deal, and I've been very wary about these type of tests ever since.
So I highly agree with Dr. Mike here, and I have actually had a lot of DNA tests come to me who have tried to get me to do advertising with them, and I've only done it a few times, and every single time has been with MyHeritage. A lot of other companies I have denied because they're not services that I believe in. The main thing that I talk about all the time on the channel is the only results I'm interested in when it comes to these DNA tests are really the matches. The admixture, the percentages of what your ancestry is coming from is slightly helpful in these aspects, but it's the DNA matches that help us uncover the family trees and help us discover the things that we're trying to search for, basically expanding our biological family tree. So for adoptees, finding their biological family; for law enforcement, helping them identify unknown remains and violent perpetrators. The main point here being that I have said no to a lot of third-party DNA companies that do things that are basically along these lines of the health and traits. And I even had one that was actually a upload your DNA for dating. If I remember correctly, they basically call themselves Tinder meets 23andMe, which is like, yeah, no thanks. That's a little weird. I'm guessing that maybe they were trying to go for people where you had the largest difference of DNA, but I don't know.
In fact, I've warned numerous patients and loved ones for years about the potential issues. And today, turns out I was right. Almost all my concerns have come to life with the recent disaster at 23andMe. Despite my early negativity of the industry, 23andMe started as a huge success story, once valued more than $6 billion. The 18-year-old company basically launched an entirely new industry, supplied data for studies on genetically influenced diseases, and helped cops solve cold cases.
23andMe did not help cops solve cold cases. This is one of the parts where I was like, okay, he's getting it wrong. 23andMe does not allow anybody to upload into their database. You have to do the spit tube test. Even more, they do not allow law enforcement access to their database. The only way to get data from 23andMe would be through subpoena or warrant, which they have a transparency report that they release on their website where you can see all the subpoenas and warrants that have been issued to them and the results of what happened with those. So this is one of the places where he's getting it wrong, and while this is just a small piece of misinformation, unfortunately, with someone like Dr. Mike, who a lot of people trust in, I do trust in him, this video is not changing any of that, it's something that a lot of people are going to go, oh, so 23andMe is working with law enforcement, and that's not true. This is not about defending 23andMe in any way. This is just about being completely nuanced in the pros and cons and the truth of everything. Which is funny to mention because in a recent video I had someone saying that I was nefariously supporting DNA tests. No, I'm just trying to speak the truth, and in a lot of my videos I talk about that, yes, when you do these DNA tests, there are risks to it, just like in the same sense of when you sign up for Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or social media sites, or you give your information to any company, you do that at your own risk where you don't know what's going to happen with that information. When you sign up for a credit card, stuff can happen to the credit card company where your information gets hacked in some sort of way. So that's one of the spots where it's kind of like, yeah, this is something that has a risk to it, but so does everything in life. So it just comes down to, is the risk worth it for you? And unfortunately with Dr. Mike's video is he doesn't talk about the areas where it would be worthwhile for people to DNA test, but then again, maybe he doesn't truly believe that the ancestry aspect is worthwhile. I do, but let's continue.
But lately, things haven't been going so well. All of the company's board members quit, and the company announced plans to lay off 40% of its employees and discontinue its therapeutics division, which had been working to develop cancer drugs. Why? Well, let's start with the fact that the science doesn't live up to the hype of the marketing. Initially, the FDA actually banned 23andMe from selling tests that included health information because they couldn't reliably predict disease risk.
This actually happened a while back now, and they made it for all the companies where they couldn't do it, because I think Ancestry had just released their health info, or were trying to release their health info part at around that time, and basically they ruled that nobody could do it, and then eventually they figured out a way where, okay, if you do it following these guidelines, that's okay. But I remember when that happened because there were a lot of us who were also worried that they might take it further and just ban DNA tests completely, even for the DNA matching stuff. Which luckily that didn't happen.
The FDA said consumers were being misled into thinking their results were clinically valid, and also that the test results were too complex for people to interpret on their own. I actually agree, because for example, if you were interested in genetic planning, let's say, or ruling out a genetic condition, these tests were not a replacement for a proper medical grade test and visit with a geneticist.
100% agree, and this is something I've been saying for years. If you truly want to learn about genetic health and doing DNA testing for your health, you need to consult an actual genetic counselor, someone who knows what they're doing, who can then have you take the proper genetic tests, and they can also go through and interpret the data properly. Because even when you get some of the tests that are much more complex, such as the whole genome sequence test, you can look at tons of variants, because whole genome sequencing is testing your entire genome, so billions of spots. Whereas with the DNA consumer tests like 23andMe and Ancestry and MyHeritage, they're only testing about 700,000 of those SNPs we were talking about, single nucleotide polymorphisms. But considering that, think about, you look at the results, if you look at that breast cancer gene and you look to see how many of those 1,000 variants do I have? Well, it's going to be a hodgepodge of all sorts of stuff, and it's going to be way too much to be able to interpret, and you really need a genetic counselor to help you with that. So none of these direct-to-consumer tests are anything that should be considered clinically viable, as he states.
Sadly, the FDA was pressured into backtracking on this ban, saying 23andMe tests came with clear enough disclaimers for consumers to know that the reports are basically just for fun and shouldn't be used to make medical decisions. Okay, sure, there are disclaimers, but the marketing for these direct-to-consumer genetic tests is really good. So good that even if companies don't say take your results seriously, people still do.
One of the things that annoys a lot of genetic genealogists, at least from my point of view, is the marketing that a lot of these DNA tests take. Not just in terms of the health aspect stuff, because he's 100% correct in that they do make it seem as if, oh, you take these tests and it's so helpful in terms of the actual health stuff, when really it's just a thing for fun, and no matter what, whether you took the DNA test or not, you need to go to a genetic counselor if you need that help. More on the ancestry side of things, if you remember, I was saying those admixture percentages really aren't that helpful. They only give us a very blurry image of people's ancestry because it's much more nuanced. Your family tree is much more nuanced. The ability to decipher these different populations, most especially defined in modern day borders, it's ridiculous. And so there's a lot of nuance in interpreting the percentages themselves, but then you see these commercials that all they're doing is advertising those percentages, and that's what most everybody focuses on, unfortunately, even though the DNA matches is what's the biggest part of these DNA tests that is truly helpful, something that is truly actionable. You can actually use it to discover your family, whether you're just looking for your history or you're looking for your actual biological family.
Do I have a cancer that is genetic? Do I have a heart condition that's going to kill me in my sleep?
Actually, if you're worried that you're genetically predisposed to a serious disease, whether it's a cancer, a neurodegenerative disorder, or anything else with a hereditary component, then your first move should be talking to a doctor, not buying an at-home test. Then the hacking began. Last year, hackers were able to access genetic data for almost 7 million 23andMe users. Criminals broke into the accounts of people who reused usernames and passwords on previously hacked sites. Those hackers were then able to steal files with ancestry info for those who've opted into a DNA relatives feature that allows related users to automatically share data with each other. Hackers basically got access to your entire family tree. And
this is one of the parts where I kind of like a lot what he's saying, but that last statement there, I hate it because it is a very misleading statement. Actually, let's replay it.
Hackers basically got access to your entire family tree.
Hackers basically got access to your entire family tree is so absolutely misleading. It is the part of this video that as soon as I saw it, I was liking this video, and now I absolutely hate it because this is too misleading. They do not have access to your entire family tree. In fact, 23andMe is one of the sites that makes it the hardest to figure out how you are related to your DNA matches. Now, 23andMe does have a family tree feature which does this auto tree building thing by comparing you and your matches, and it tries to figure out a possible tree based on how your closest matches are matching you. But in my experience with those trees they're building, they're often very well off, and even more, they don't give any actual information on the family tree. Now, this isn't to say that they aren't getting some of the family tree info, but what they are getting is likely going to be very minimal because, for one, it's going to be dependent on that person having gone in and putting that information in. But 23andMe doesn't give you the ability to put that much in. And even when people put stuff in, it takes a lot of experience to be able to build and understand the true family tree. So at best, the people getting this information are only going to be able to build a very minimal family tree, and there's not going to be that much information they're going to be able to get from it. But for anyone who has done genetic genealogy and gone through the motions of figuring out who these DNA matches are and how they're related to you, it takes a lot of work. And there's really not that much that these people are going to be able to figure out from it unless they know how to do this work. But even more, it takes a lot of work just to do it for one singular person. There's no AI tools or anything out there that really does this in any sort of efficient way. I mean, in all honesty, these hackers could probably find a lot of that information much quicker if they just go to Ancestry and do a member search, and likely find a lot of those people just by using the usernames of their email. Now, we'll give Dr. Mike some leeway in that he probably doesn't have a lot of personal experience with genetic genealogy and how much work it takes to understand the DNA results and how to figure out the DNA matches and how they're related and all of that. But at the same time, I would hope that in a lot of his research, especially because he talks a lot about a lot of things that a lot of other people don't, I would hope that he would have found the usefulness of this and the difficulty of actually doing genetic genealogy and wouldn't have made a statement like that. But I do want to give him a little bit of credit for this part in the sense that when he's discussing the hack, he's discussing what actually happened in the terms of that it was a stuffing attack where it was email addresses with known passwords that they acquired from elsewhere, and they just were logging into tons and tons of people's profiles. So while I can tell he did a lot of research, it definitely feels like he's falling flat in terms of discussing the ancestry aspect in a truly nuanced way.
And for some reason, specifically went after users with Chinese or Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry.
Which I find that's hilarious that they went after Chinese and Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry because, one, there's very few people who are Chinese in the database. The few times I've seen people take 23andMe tests that have Chinese ancestry, they find very few of their relatives in there, and most of the people that they're finding are just Chinese Americans where they're such distant relatives that they're not going to figure it out. But even more in the Jewish aspect, Jews are an endogamous population, which basically means that Jews have married Jews and had children only with other Jews largely for generations upon generations, meaning that they share more DNA with each other on average. Endogamy is common in a lot of different population groups. It's usually due to some sort of geographic sort of thing, like island populations. Pacific Islanders have some of the most hardcore endogamy when you look at their DNA results, as well as just religious or cultural for whatever reason. So another major endogamous population is the Cajun and Creole populations, which come out of its own endogamous population, which is the French Canadians. But basically, when you're dealing with an endogamous population, it makes it really difficult to figure out anything genetic genealogy-wise because the matches share much more DNA in smaller amounts, basically smaller segments, but a lot more of them, so they add up to larger totals. And thus much harder to figure out what's going on with those.
And sold that data on the dark web. While this hack affected a lot of people, it actually wasn't the worst case scenario. They got profile information, but thankfully they didn't steal the full genetic codes.
Now this part, I am also happy with how he showed that. I think he watched Mudahar's video, Ordinary Gamers, especially because the screen he just showed with the hacker message, I'm pretty sure the only place I ever saw that was Ordinary Gamers. And he was also the one where I learned that, yes, it was a stuffing attack. But what he's saying here in terms of they didn't get the actual genetic data, basically you can download your raw DNA file from 23andMe. It's what's called a CSV file, comma separated values. So it's just very simple. It shows every single SNP that they've tested and what the base pairs are there. So when you look at it, you just see numbers, RS109734 or something, and then AT, and then, whatever every single SNP is called.
Probably the most relevant concern I have is about third-party data sharing. 23andMe isn't a healthcare organization, so they're not required to protect your health info the same way hospitals or even health insurance companies are, aka no HIPAA. It's allowed to share user data externally and can even change its sharing policies at any time. Originally, 23andMe shared genetic data with other companies and institutions unless users specifically said they couldn't. By default, they were sharing your data without you even knowing. Thankfully, this policy did change in 2018, and now you do need to give consent before your data goes somewhere else. But there are several types of consent. You can agree to let the company share your data with all third parties, like insurance companies and big pharma. One positive thing here is that health insurance companies can deny coverage or charge people more based on their genetic testing results. Genetic discrimination has been prohibited by federal law since 2008. But that's only health insurance. In many cases, companies that sell disability or long-term care insurance are allowed to factor genetic information into their policies. Now,
So this is somewhere where I really have to give Dr. Mike a lot of credit, and somewhere where he really shines, especially comparing him to a lot of the other videos I've seen that are talking about 23andMe, or especially just kind of discussing the issues around DNA testing, which honestly, the majority of them all kind of lean towards fear-mongering. But this is the first one where I've really seen someone discuss GINA, which is what we nicknamed this law, Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And while I know Dr. Mike's video is geared towards an American audience, for those who live elsewhere, most especially those in Europe and people in Australia and New Zealand, there are also laws that apply to genetic information, such as the GDPR laws in Europe, which make it so that genetic companies can't share genetic information.
all third-party sharing, you could still agree to let 23andMe share your data with researchers for studies. This can allow you to participate in research with your data pooled into a group, or let researchers use your individual level genetic data. Both pooled and individual level data are de-identified using a code or algorithm before being included in research to help protect the user's identity. However, some genetic privacy experts say it's theoretically possible for users to be traced back to their genetic data.
I mean, yeah, it would be possible to trace someone back to their genetic data if you have a viable profile that's uploadable to one of the genetic genealogy databases. Basically, you have to have a profile that has enough SNPs in the proper CSV format, and then uploading it to GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA or MyHeritage, because those are the companies that allow uploading, and basically you would just have to upload it, look at their DNA matches, and figure out who they were in the same way that a search angel helps identify an adoptee's biological family, or how an investigative genetic genealogist helps identify unknown human remains or a violent perpetrator. They just look at their cousins and figure out your family tree, because every person's family tree is kind of like their own fingerprint to them and their siblings, for the most part. In other words, the cousins that you have on your mom's side and your dad's side at those distances, only you and your siblings have that signature. Now, of course, these websites have terms of service that say people cannot upload others' DNA without their permission. So if you are sharing your DNA through one of these third parties and somebody does this to you, then what they're doing is illegal and it's against the terms of service of the company. But obviously, this is something that happens at every company. You have to trust that the company and their employees will adhere to what they've said they'll do, and you just never know when there's some nefarious person that might use that information against you. Same thing with Facebook, same thing with Instagram, same thing with every website that you ever sign up for.
In general, these privacy risks related to at-home genetic tests are new, but they're getting a ton of attention right now because of the 23andMe spiral. What troubles me most is if the company goes under or gets sold, who will own all that genetic data? Their user agreement states that if the company is acquired, user data will likely go to the company that buys it. And if that happened, the new owner could keep their current privacy policies, or it could change them. It would be their choice. Right now, privacy laws in about 12 states would require customers to give consent before 23andMe could transfer their data to a new owner, but most states don't go that far, and there's no federal law to that effect. So what can 23andMe users actually do? For starters, remove consent from all types of third-party sharing. The other critical step is deleting your data ASAP. The website actually has instructions on how to do it. One caveat though, 23andMe outsources its genotyping to labs, and they are obligated to keep customers' genetic info as raw data with their sex and date of birth for a couple of years before deleting it, so it's not instant. My advice here, Before you share genetic data with any company, think really carefully if it's worth the potential risks. Review all user agreements and consent policies with a magnifying glass. And consider asking your doctor if a proper geneticist referral is better for you. Your DNA is the most personal data you have. It's not just an identifier. It's who you are.
Okay, so that video is really good for the most part. Obviously, I have some issues with it, which I've largely covered already. But I think there at the end, it makes a good point in that if you don't want to have your DNA in there, get rid of it, consider the risks, all of that. The only thing is that in this entire video, he really didn't even talk about what is the one true benefit of these DNA tests, and that is identifying your biological family, expanding your family trait. That's not going to be something everybody's interested in, and if you're not that interested in it, the risks of a DNA test might not be for you. There are truly risks. Everything he mentions in terms of the risks with DNA testing, in terms of the health results not being very reliable, in terms of the risks of that you're giving it to a company and they can change their terms of service, which happened recently with GEDmatch multiple different times. Granted, that's a company that people were uploading their DNA to, not actually testing with them, but still the same thing of the terms of service were changing, and a lot of people left the company, took their DNA out of that database because they were not happy with it. So definitely consider all of the risks. Look at the terms of service, read all of the privacy statements and everything that is involved with it, because if you don't feel that the benefits outweigh the risks, then it's not worth it for you. But for a lot of people that are trying to find their biological family, whether they're an adoptee or whether they're someone who already knows their family tree and just wants to expand upon it, this may be something where the risks aren't that big of a deal for you. And one of the other things I want to say in terms of what he said there about, your DNA is, yours. I forgot it. What did he say exactly?
Your DNA is the most personal data you have. It's not just an identifier. It's who you are.
So that last statement there, your personal DNA is not just an identifier, it's who you are. The thing is that if someone truly wanted to get your DNA and they were focused on your DNA specifically, it's not that hard to do so. Police do this all the time. They get what's known as a surreptitious sample, which basically just means that if they're trying to get DNA from somebody, they wait until they smoke a cigarette and throw it out, go and eat at a diner and then go grab the cup or the fork or whatever, or someone spits on the ground and they see them do it and they go and swab it real quickly. That's a surreptitious sample. Now, obviously, it's not very easy for people that are, not within that world to be able to do this, because very few companies take DNA like that. And even more, most of the time when they're doing surreptitious samples, they're not doing a consumer grade DNA test, which is testing those 700,000 SNPs. Instead, they're doing an autosomal STR test. So basically what they're doing is short tandem repeats, which is looking at a sequence of your DNA where it repeats. So ACT, ACT, ACT. And they're looking at only 13 spots, 13 loci of STRs as opposed to 700,000 autosomal SNPs for these tests like 23andMe and Ancestry. And that's the other thing to consider too, is that he's only discussing autosomal SNP tests in this video. There are other consumer tests available. One I've already mentioned is whole genome sequencing, which does test your autosomal DNA, but instead of testing 700,000 SNPs, it's testing the billions upon billions of base pairs that you have in your autosomal DNA, as well as your sex chromosomes. So autosomal DNA is those 22 chromosomes you hear about, and then you have the 23rd pair of chromosomes, which are your sex chromosomes, so either XX or XY for the most part. And then there's also mitochondrial DNA. So a whole genome sequence test is testing all of that. Your autosomal DNA, your sex chromosomes, and your mitochondrial DNA. But then even more, there's mitochondrial DNA tests and Y-DNA tests that you can take elsewhere. So Family Tree DNA is one of the main sites that people do that, and that can be very helpful in a specific way for ancestry research. Y chromosomes are passed in a specific inheritance pattern from father to son that allows us to trace that back thousands of years. And then same thing with mitochondrial DNA, but it's being passed from mother to child. So we can trace the maternal line for thousands of years. So the at-home genetic test that Dr. Mike is discussing is a very specific type of test, the autosomal SNP test, the 23andMe's, Ancestry, MyHeritage, etc. And being that Dr. Mike has Eastern European Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, I wonder if he'd ever want me to do his family tree for my YouTuber family tree series, which doesn't require him to have done a DNA test, but obviously if he does one, that helps in terms of me being able to do the ancestry stuff, but I don't know if he'd even want to do something like that. But if he did, I'd definitely be one of the people that could actually help him because I have experience tracing Eastern European Jewish ancestry. So Dr. Mike, if you're watching, hit me up. I'd love to have you as a guest on that. And if you enjoyed this reaction and you'd like to see more just like it, be sure to check out this video of mine right here. Thank you to my Patreon patrons and YouTube members.